The door slammed shut behind the Jackson family with a force that made the walls tremble. Mr. Jackson, holding his youngest daughter in one arm, stared at the eviction notice stuck to the door of their apartment. The word "evicted" was scrawled in thick red letters across the top, as if to shout at them even louder than the landlord had moments earlier. "Your kind don't belong here, Mr. Whitman," the landlord had sneered moments before, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. His pale face twisted into a satisfied grin as he gestured toward the street. "Take your things and get out. I don't care if you have nowhere else to go." Mrs. Jackson tried to reason with him, tears streaming down her face. "We've paid our rent on time every month. This is our home," she pleaded. But Mr. Whitman wasn't listening. "This is my building, and I decide who stays." "I'm tired of seeing your faces," he said coldly, before stepping back inside and slamming the door in their faces. Standing in the cold, their belongings scattered around them on the pavement, the family didn't know where to go next. But what none of them could have imagined was that this moment of humiliation would set off a chain of events that would bring justice in the most unexpected way. What would happen to the Jackson family, and how would fate deal with Mr. Whitman? 2 weeks earlier, the Jackson family was enjoying their modest but happy life in apartment 3B. The building wasn't fancy, but it was home. The children played in the small courtyard, and Mrs. Jackson often chatted with the neighbors while hanging laundry. Mr. Jackson worked long hours at the local hardware store to keep food on the table. Life wasn't easy, but they made it work. Things started to change when Mr. Whitman began showing signs of irritation whenever he saw them. He complained about the children's laughter being too loud in the courtyard and accused the family of not keeping their unit clean. Mrs. Jackson had overheard him muttering to another tenant, "I don't know why I ever rented to them." One day, Mr. Jackson came home to find a warning notice taped to their door, claiming they had violated the building's noise policy. When he confronted Mr. Whitman, the landlord dismissed his concerns, saying it was just a formality. The next week, things escalated when Mr. Whitman accused them of damaging the laundry room. Mrs. Jackson knew it wasn't true. They hadn't even used the laundry room in days. But when she tried to defend her family, Mr. Whitman snapped, saying, "Maybe you people would be more comfortable somewhere else." That night, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson sat at their kitchen table, trying to figure out why their landlord had suddenly turned on them. "It's not sudden," Mrs. Jackson said quietly. "He's always felt this way. He just hid it better than before." The eviction notice came 2 days later, leaving the family in shock. Mr. Whitman gave them 24 hours to leave, even though the law required a formal process. They knew he was counting on them not knowing their rights. And so they stood, belongings in hand, staring at the door that had just closed on their home. But this wasn't the end. The Jacksons weren't going to let Mr. Whitman win. They had a plan on that would reveal the truth and bring consequences to the man who thought he could push them around. The Jacksons spent the night crammed into their car, parked on the edge of a park. The cold crept through the windows, making it hard to sleep. Mr. Jackson, though exhausted, stayed awake, silently fuming over the landlord's blatant injustice. "We can't let him get away with this," he said to Mrs. Jackson in a hushed tone, careful not to wake the children. "But what can we do?" she whispered back, her voice trembling. "He has the power, and we're out on the street." Mr. Jackson shook his head. "Not for long. He broke the law, and he's counting on us not knowing it. He'll figure this out." The next morning, the family headed to a local community center, where a friend had told them about free legal aid services. There, they met Ms. Reed, a sharp and determined attorney who listened carefully to their story. "Evicting you without proper notice is illegal," she said, her voice firm. "And his comments? They're discriminatory. This isn't just an eviction case, it's a civil rights violation." Hearing those words filled the Jacksons with a mixture of hope and anger. "So we can fight this?" Mr. Jackson asked, leaning forward in his chair. "You can and you should," Miss Reed replied. "But it won't be easy. Landlords like him often think they're untouchable. Well, need evidence." That night, the Jacksons moved into a temporary shelter arranged through the community center. It wasn't ideal, but it was a safe place to regroup. Mrs. Jackson started going through their old paperwork, looking for anything that could prove Mr. Whitman's bias. Meanwhile, Mr. Jackson made calls to neighbors who might be willing to testify. Some were hesitant, fearing retaliation from the landlord, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Alvarez, agreed to help. "I've lived here for 20 years, she said. "I've seen him pull this nonsense before, but no one ever stood up to him." As the days passed, Miss Reed helped the Jacksons build a solid case. She filed a formal complaint against Mr. Whitman, citing unlawful eviction and racial discrimination. Word of the lawsuit began to spread through the community, and tenants started sharing their own stories about the landlord's unfair treatment. Despite the progress, the Jacksons faced challenges. The court date was weeks away, and they still didn't have a permanent place to live. The children struggled with the sudden upheaval, and Mr. Jackson's work hours were cut after he missed a shift dealing with the crisis. One evening, as the family sat together in the shelter's communal area, a volunteer handed Mr. Jackson an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "You'll never win. Drop the case or things will get worse for you. A friend." Mr. Jackson's hands shook as he read the note aloud. "He's trying to scare us," he said, looking around at his family. "But we're not backing down." The note had the opposite effect of what Mr. Whitman intended. It fueled their determination. And then, just when they thought things couldn't get worse, the shelter director approached them with a grim expression. "We have a problem," she said. "You need to leave by tomorrow. We're over capacity and we have no choice." The Jacksons stared at the shelter director, disbelief etched across their faces. "We have nowhere else to go," Mrs. Jackson said, her voice trembling. "I'm truly sorry," the director replied, looking genuinely pained. "But the city only allows a certain number of people here, and we've hit that limit. I'll do everything I can to connect you with another place." The children began to cry as the reality sank in. Mr. Jackson clenched his fists, anger and frustration bubbling inside him. "This isn't right. First we're kicked out of our home, and now this. How much more are we supposed to take?" By morning, they were back in their car, belongings piled in the trunk. Mrs. Jackson made desperate calls to shelters and family friends, but every answer was the same. "We're full." Just as it seemed hopeless, a surprising call came. Ms. Reed had heard about their situation and arranged for them to stay temporarily in a motel funded by a local charity. It wasn't much, but it gave them a roof over their heads. Days turned into weeks as the legal process moved forward. Ms. Reed had managed to secure an early hearing, and the case was gaining traction in the local news. A reporter from a small newspaper interviewed the Jacksons, eager to expose the injustice. "This isn't just about us," Mr. Jackson told the reporter. "It's about every family that's been treated like they don't matter. Someone has to stand up." The article painted a vivid picture of Mr. Whitman's long history of discrimination. Other former tenants came forward, sharing similar experiences of being targeted because of their race or background. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitman didn't take the growing attention lightly. He filed a countersuit, claiming the Jacksons had damaged the property and violated their lease agreement. It was a blatant lie, but it added stress to an already difficult situation. "I think he's trying to drag this out until we give up," Mrs. Jackson said one night, sitting on the edge of the motel bed. "He doesn't know us," Mr. Jackson replied firmly. "We're not giving up." The day of the hearing finally arrived. The Jacksons walked into the courtroom, their nerves on edge but their resolve unshaken. Mr. Whitman sat across the room, looking smug and confident. Ms. Reed presented their case with precision, using the eviction notice and testimony from neighbors as evidence. She even revealed a recording from another tenant who had captured Mr. Whitman making discriminatory remarks. When it was Mr. Whitman's turn, he denied everything, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "I treat all my tenants fairly," he said, his voice oozing false charm. The judge listened carefully but didn't give away any reactions. As the day wore on, tension filled the room. Just when it seemed the Jacksons had made their point, Mr. Whitman dropped a bombshell. "Your Honor," he said, "I have proof that the Jackson family has been harassing me and other tenants. I'd like to submit these documents as evidence." He handed a folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The Jacksons exchanged worried glances, unsure of what the landlord could possibly have fabricated. The judge scanned the papers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up and said, "This changes things. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning for further review." The Jacksons left the courtroom in stunned silence. What was in the documents? Could it derail their fight for justice? The Jacksons barely slept that night, haunted by the uncertainty of what Mr. Whitman had presented to the court. "What if he made up something we can't disprove?" Mrs. Jackson asked, her voice shaking. "He's a liar," Mr. Jackson replied, gripping her hand. "Lies crumble under the truth. We just have to hold on." The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with tension as the hearing resumed. The judge addressed the court. "After reviewing the documents submitted yesterday, I found several allegations against the Jacksons, including harassment and property damage. However, these claims require supporting evidence, which I'll allow the defendant to present now." Mr. Whitman smirked as he rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I have security footage showing the Jacksons causing disturbances in the building and damaging the laundry room." He signaled to his lawyer, who handed over a USB drive. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff loaded it into the system and began playing the video. At first, the footage appeared damning. A man resembling Mr. Jackson was seen shouting at neighbors and slamming doors. Another clip showed someone kicking over bins in the laundry room. Gasps filled the room and the Jacksons looked horrified. "That's not me," Mr. Jackson exclaimed, standing up. "I've never done any of that." "Order in the court," the judge said, banging his gavel. Ms. Reed leaned over to Mr. Jackson, her eyes narrowing. "Something's off about this footage. Let me handle this." When it was her turn to cross-examine, Ms. Reed stepped forward confidently. "Mr. Whitman, could you confirm the date and time of these recordings?" "Of course," he said smugly. "They are from the week leading up to the eviction notice." "Interesting," Ms. Reed replied, her voice steady. "Because my client wasn't even in the building on some of those dates. He was working double shifts at the hardware store, which we can prove with his TIM e-cards." Mr. Whitman's smirk faltered. "And another thing," Ms. Reed continued, "I'd like to call an expert witness to examine the footage for authenticity." The judge nodded, and a technician who Ms. Reed had arranged earlier stepped forward. After a brief analysis, the technician looked up and said, "Your Honor, this video has been doctored. The timestamps have been manipulated, and there are clear signs of splicing." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Mr. Whitman's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but the landlord still tried to argue. "That's ridiculous. They're just trying to discredit me." Before the judge could respond, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have something to say." Everyone turned to see Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly neighbor who had agreed to testify for the Jacksons. She was holding a small recorder. "I was afraid to share this at first," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't stay silent anymore. I recorded a conversation with Mr. Whitman the day after he evicted the Jacksons. You need to hear it." She handed the device to the bailiff, who played the recording aloud. In it, Mr. Whitman could be heard laughing with another tenant, saying, "Good riddance. I don't want their kind in my building. I'll make up whatever I need to keep them out." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge's face turned stern. "Mr. Whitman," the judge said, his tone sharp, "you've been caught fabricating evidence and admitting to discrimination. We will proceed accordingly." Mr. Whitman's confidence crumbled as the weight of his actions began to sink in. But before the judge could deliver a verdict, the bailiff interrupted. "Your Honor, we have an emergency update. Another tenant has come forward with critical information." The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as everyone turned to the bailiff, who was holding a stack of papers. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Another witness. Please bring them forward." A tall, middle-aged man with a nervous look on his face stepped up to the witness stand. He was trembling, but he stood tall as he spoke. "My name is James Tucker. I live in one of Mr. Whitman's other buildings, and I've witnessed him treat tenants like garbage, especially people of color. I'm here to tell the truth." The room was still as the man began his testimony. "I moved in about a year ago. At first, Mr. Whitman seemed friendly, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. He constantly made rude comments about tenants of different races and backgrounds. When I started talking to people in the building, I realized he'd been doing the same to a lot of them. The Jacksons weren't the first to face this treatment." James paused, clearly struggling with the weight of what he was about to say. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier, but I was scared of losing my apartment. Mr. Whitman had a reputation for evicting anyone who didn't agree with him." The judge looked directly at Mr. Whitman, his voice cold. "This testimony, along with the other evidence, paints a clear picture. You've been using your position to harm tenants and discriminate against them based on their race. This is not acceptable in any form." But Mr. Whitman wasn't finished yet. With a look of desperation, he stood up, slamming his hands on the desk. "You can't do this. I'm a respected member of this community. This is all lies. They're trying to ruin me." But the more he shouted, the more the courtroom turned against him. His credibility had completely shattered. Ms. Reed, who had been quietly watching, stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I believe we have seen enough. Mr. Whitman has not only evicted a family unlawfully, but has also attempted to destroy their reputation and intimidate them with fabricated evidence. It's time to deliver justice." The judge nodded solemnly, then turned to the defendant. "Mr. Whitman, you are guilty of unlawful eviction, racial discrimination, and attempting to tamper with evidence. You will face legal consequences, and I will ensure the Jacksons are compensated for your actions. In addition, I will recommend that your property management license be revoked." The room was filled with applause from the Jackson supporters in the audience. Mrs. Jackson wiped away a tear of relief, while Mr. Jackson squeezed her hand tightly. But then, just as the courtroom began to clear, the unexpected happened. The door swung open, and a man in a suit walked briskly to the front. He held out a file to the judge. "Your Honor," the man said, "I have additional evidence that may change the outcome of this case. I work for the Housing Authority, and what you've uncovered here is only the beginning." The judge looked at the man, then back at the Jacksons, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" The man smiled, but it was a cold smile. "I'm afraid this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's more to this landlord's empire than you realize. Much more." And with that chilling statement, the courtroom went silent once again. What was this new evidence, and how would it affect the Jacksons' fight for justice?